The area of Wormsley consisted of a golf course, 2 hotels, and some modern luxury houses overlooking the golf course. There was also a row of shops that were once upscale before the war, a train station, and from the train station, a main road led to London on the left, while a small dirt road, marked by a sign reading to Wormsley Prior, led to the right, cutting through a field. Wormsley Prior, nestled among wooded hills, was very different from Wormsley Hit. It was essentially a very small town, built to serve as a market in the old style, which had now deteriorated into merely a village with a single main street surrounded by Georgian-style houses, a few inns, and some old-fashioned shops. Its general appearance gave the impression of being 150 miles from London, rather than the actual 28 miles. The residents all agreed on their disdain for the rapid development that was taking place in Wormsley Hit. On the outskirts of the village were some beautiful old houses with lovely gardens, one of which, named White House, had been returned to Lynn Dashmont in early spring 1946 when she was discharged from the Royal Navy. On her 3rd morning there, she looked out from her bedroom window across the unkempt grassy meadow to the elm trees in the green land and inhaled the air with delight. It was a pleasant morning, filled with the scent of wet earth that she had missed during the past 3 years. How wonderful it was to be back in her country, how wonderful to be here in her small bedroom that she had longed for a while overseas, and how wonderful to finally remove her naval uniform and wear a sweater and woolen skirt, even if the moths had done their damage during the war years. It was good for her to have left the Navy and returned as a free woman again. Although she had truly enjoyed her service abroad, the work had been somewhat exciting, but also full of routine annoyances. The feeling of being treated like a herd with her colleagues had made her eager to escape. During that sweltering summer in the East, she thought of her longing and nostalgia Wormsley Prior, the old cold and beautiful house, and her dear mother. Lynn loved her mother and was both annoyed by and affectionate towards her. While she was far from home, she remained attached to her and only forgot the annoyance, or remembered it with an extra pang of homesickness for her dear mother. How wonderful it would be to hear her mother's repetitive phrases in her sweet complaining voice, or to never leave home again. Here she was, out of service, standing once again in her home. It had been 3 days since her return, and yet a strange feeling of restlessness and dissatisfaction had begun to creep into her. Everything was as it used to be. The house, her mother, Rolly, the farm, and the family. What was different, and what should have been different, was her own self. Her mother, Mrs. Marchant, called from downstairs, "My dear, shall I bring you a lovely breakfast in bed?" Lynn shouted back, "No, of course not, I'm coming down," and thought about why her mother had to use the term "my dear." It was such a silly expression. She hurried down the stairs and into the dining room. The breakfast was not special, and Lynn had begun to realize that finding food required more time and attention than usual. Mrs. Marchmont was alone in the house, except for a somewhat unreliable maid, Nanny, who worked for days a week, and in between, Mrs. Marchmont struggled with cooking and cleaning. She was about 40 when she had Lynn and her health was not good. Lynn noted with some regret how the family's financial situation had deteriorated. The modest fixed income that once allowed them to live comfortably before the war had now dwindled by half due to taxes, while costs and wages had risen. Lynn told herself that the new boat world was here. Then her eyes fell on the newspaper columns, reading former Royal Air Force member seeking a job that values initiative and enthusiasm, former Royal Navy member seeking a position requiring organizational skills and responsibility. Initiative, enthusiasm, leadership, these were the goods on offer. But what was needed? What was needed were people who could cook and clean, who had the right credentials, who were diligent and knew the ropes and could provide good service. Well, that didn't affect her. Her path was clear. Marriage to her cousin Rolly Claude. He had proposed to her 7 years ago, just before the war, and as far as she could remember, she had always intended to marry Rolly. She had quickly agreed to his choice of a farming life, a good life. Although it might not be an exciting life and was full of hard work, the two of them enjoyed working outdoors and raising animals. This didn't mean their aspirations were as they had been before, for Uncle Borden. Her thoughts were interrupted by her mother's voice. It was a severe blow for all of us. "Dear Lynn, as I wrote to you, Gordon had only been in England for 2 days, so we never saw him. If he hadn't stayed in London, if he had come directly here, yes, if, far from home, Lynn had been shocked and saddened by her uncle's death, but she had not truly grasped its significance until now. Gordon Claude had controlled her life, and everyone else's for as long as she could remember. That wealthy man, who had no children, had taken all his relatives under his wing completely. Even Rolly and his friend Johnny Falvers had started a partnership in farming. Their capital was small, but they were full of hope and energy, and Gordon Claude had been supportive of the idea. He had gone beyond that, saying, "One cannot succeed in farming without capital. The first thing to discover is whether these two young men have the necessary will and energy to start work. If I support them now, I won't be able to see that before years have passed, but if they have the right stuff, and I am convinced they are putting in the effort required, then, Lynn, don't worry about them. I will provide them with the necessary capital, so don't worry about your future. My girl, you are the wife Rolly needs, but remember what I told you." She had kept it a secret, but Rolly himself had been well aware of it. He had to prove that he and his partner were running a successful business. Yes, they had all relied on Gordon Claude, but that didn't mean any of the family members were lazy or idle. Jeremy Claude was a partner in a law firm. Lionel Claude was a practicing doctor, but financial security had always been a background to their daily working lives, with no need to skimp or save, as Gordon Claude, the childless widower, had taken care of it all, and had told them repeatedly that everything was in order. His widow, Mrs. Marchant, had remained in the White House, although she could have moved to a smaller and less cumbersome house. Lynn had received her education at the best schools and could choose any specialty, no matter the cost. Gordon Claude had always been committed to meeting the family's needs and providing a dignified life. Everything had been completely settled, guaranteed, until suddenly, Gordon Claude's unexpected marriage. Mrs. Marchmont continued, "Of course, we were all devastated, but one thing was certain, Gordon would never marry again. It was not due to any deficiency in relationships or family ties." Lynn thought there were indeed many family ties. Sometimes those ties seemed excessive. Mrs. Marchmont continued, "He was always very kind, though it was teamed with a small amount of tyranny. He never liked to eat at a bare table, insisting always on covering it with special tablecloths. He even sent me some beautiful tablecloths from Venice when he was in Italy." Lynn simply replied, "It must have been very gratifying to comply with his wishes," then added with curiosity, "How did he meet his second wife? You didn't tell me about that in your letters. Was it on a plane or something like that? During his travels, after all those years and all those secretaries, typists, and housekeepers?" Lynn smiled as her memory recalled how Gordon Claude's secretaries, housekeepers, and office staff were closely monitored and suspected. She added with curiosity, "Was she beautiful?" "Well, dear, I personally think she has a silly face." "You're not a man, Mother." "And she was, of course, injured in the raid and suffered a very severe illness afterward. I doubt she ever recovered completely. She's a bundle of nerves, if you know what I mean, and sometimes she seems to be of half a mind. I don't feel she could have been a suitable companion for poor Gordon." Lynn smiled, doubting that Gordon Claude had married a woman significantly younger than him for her mental companionship. Mrs. Marchmont lowered her voice and said, "And she, my dear, though I hate to say it, is not quite one of us." "Oh, poor thing. I really don't know what you mean, Lynn. We all made a great effort to be kind and polite, and to welcome her among us, for Gordon's sake." Lynn asked curiously, "Is she at Foropodic, then?" "Yes, of course. And where else would she go after leaving the hospital? The doctors advised against her staying in London. She's at Foropodic with her brother." "And how is her brother?" "He's a rather taciturn young man," Mrs. Marchmont said after a pause, adding with emphasis, "He's rather withdrawn." Lynn felt a fleeting wave of sympathy and thought to herself, "I would be rude if I were in his place." Then she asked her mother, "What's his name?" "David Hunter. He's Irish. They're certainly not from a well-known family. She was Armenian, and her former husband's name was Andre. I don't mean to be unkind, but one can't help but wonder what kind of widow travels across South America during wartime. One can't help but feel she was looking for a wealthy husband. And in this case, her search wasn't in vain." Mrs. Marchmont sighed and said, "It seemed so strange. Gordon was always such a clever man, even though women didn't fail to try to win him over like his last secretary. For instance, she was really rather insipid. I suppose she was highly competent, but there was something about her that made him want to get rid of her." Lynn remarked with a hint of mystery. I suppose everyone has their battles they lose. It's extremely dangerous, and I think that war makes one lose stability and peace. But I can't describe the shock when we received his letter from New York. What did he say in it, exactly? He wrote to Frances, and I don't really know why he chose her. Perhaps he thought she, given her upbringing, might be more sympathetic and understanding. He said we might be surprised to hear of his marriage, that it all happened rather suddenly, but he was confident that we would all love Rosalind, such a theatrical name. Don't you think? Dear, it seems rather false. He said she had lived a very difficult life, had suffered a lot despite being quite young, and had faced life with truly remarkable courage. A familiar tactic, Lynn said. I agree with you. I've heard such embellishments many times, but one would think that Gordon, with his experience, anyway. That's what happened. She has very large, blue eyes. Is she beautiful? Oh yes, perhaps she was, but her beauty isn't the kind I like. Lynn commented with a smile. You don't like any beauty? Yes, dear, but oh, men are so unpredictable. Even the most stable ones can do the most foolish things. And Gordon went on to assure us in his letter that we should not think for a moment that his marriage would mean any reduction in the old ties and connections. He assured us that he still considers us all his personal responsibility. But he didn't write a will after his marriage, did he? The last will he wrote was in 1940. I don't know the details, but he made it clear that it had covered all of us in case something happened to him. His marriage invalidated that will, of course. Perhaps he would have written a new will when he returned home, but he didn't have the time. He was killed practically the day after he arrived in the country. So Rosalind gets everything. Then, yes, his marriage invalidated the old will. Lynn was pensive. She wasn't particularly materialistic, but she couldn't help feeling angered by the situation. She felt that Gordon Claw wouldn't have imagined or accepted such a scenario. Perhaps he would have left most of his wealth to his young wife, but he would certainly have left some share to the family. He encouraged to rely on him. He had repeatedly urged them not to save or hoard for the future. She had heard him say to Jeremy, "You'll be a proper man when I die." And to her mother, "Don't worry, Adela, Lynn will always be under my care, and you know it." He had urged Raouli to take up farming and had encouraged Anthony, Jeremy's son, to join the household cavalry, always providing generous allowances. He had also encouraged Lionel Claude to pursue certain paths in medical research that did not offer immediate profits and to continue his studies. But Lynn's train of thought was interrupted as she took out a set of receipts and said, with trembling lips, "Look at these receipts. What am I supposed to do? What am I to do? For heaven's sake, the bank manager sent me a note this morning saying I've withdrawn more than my account holds. I can't see a way out. I was extremely careful, but it seems that my investments no longer yield what they used to. He said it's the increases in taxes, and all those yellow papers they call war damage insurance or whatever. One has to pay them whether one wants to or not." Mrs. Marchmont said with a tone of pity, "I think I must move from here, but where should I go? There are no small houses here. There really are no small houses. I don't want to trouble you with all these matters, Lynn, not now that you've just returned home, but I don't know what to do. I really don't know." Lynn looked at her mother, who had passed 60. She was never one of those physically strong women. During the war, she had hosted civilians evacuated from London, cooked and cleaned for them, worked with the War Victims Association, made bandages, and helped with school meals. She worked 14 hours a day, a stark contrast to her peaceful life before the war. Lynn now saw her on the brink of collapse, exhausted and frightened for the future. A slow, steady anger crept into Lynn's mind as she said calmly, "Can Rosalind help?" Mrs. Marchmont blushed and said, "We have no right to ask for anything." Lynn protested, "I think you have a moral right. Uncle Gordon always helped us." Her mother shook her head and said, "It wouldn't be nice, dear, to ask for favors from people we don't like. Besides, her brother wouldn't let her part with a single penny. And," she added, with a note of feminine cunning in her voice, "if she really is her brother's sister,